Hi, welcome back to 40 Days with the Fathers. Today is day 4, and this is the Epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians. With a quick who, what, why and when, since it's a new text. Who? Polycarp of Smyrna, who was a direct disciple of the Apostle John. We also have some information about Polycarp by Irenaeus, who also knew Polycarp, in his book Against Heresies III, book 3. But Polycarp also was not only instructed by apostles and conversed with many who had seen Christ, but was also, by apostles in Asia, appointed bishop of the church in Smyrna. So we see that Polycarp knew the apostles, was instructed by John, also spoke to many people who had also seen Jesus in the flesh, and then he was appointed as a bishop in Smyrna, which is in modern-day Turkey, if I remember. So he's quite a direct link back to the original 12. This letter contains many exhortations to the Philippian church by Polycarp. This epistle is also referenced by Irenaeus in one of his letters as recommended reading for those who are anxious about their salvation, so they can learn the character of Polycarp's faith and the preaching of truth from him. Something we see, Polycarp comes highly recommended by people as a very godly man and a person of very strong character and faith. Why? Much like the New Testament letter to the Philippians, it's written to encourage the church on its faith and perseverance of salvation. And it's dated around 110 to 140 AD. And there's a little footnote, just to give it some context. Scholars generally agree that Paul wrote his epistle to the Philippians around 62 AD. So only about 40 odd years later, this was being written to them by another person. So one of the main things that will strike you about this letter is that if you didn't know any better, you'd think it was a Pauline epistle you were reading. It has all the trappings of a classic New Testament pastoral letter to a local church, from the way it opens with the typical greetings and salutations, to the way it closes with praise and recommendations of other believers. This letter is all about encouraging and urging the church in Philippi to continue to stay strong in the faith delivered to them, since they had a strong root of faith spoken of in days gone by, which is a direct reference to Paul's letter of encouragement found in Philippians 1, verses 3 to 6. There's also many references to other New Testament letters in here, that you can find at least one reference in nearly all of the canonized books, plus a couple of Old Testament quotes, including one from Tobit. And if you're not familiar with that one, Tobit, the Book of Tobit is part of the Catholic and Orthodox biblical canon, but if you're a Protestant, you probably won't have seen it, unless you've got the Apocrypha in the middle between the two Testaments. This in itself gives a small insight to what books were being considered as authoritative within the church communities during this early period. Polycarp does mention that the blessed and glorified Paul in his letter, and gives him his dues so as not to appear to be stepping on toes, with a short summary of Paul's original letter to this church and its purpose. And I quote, "He, Paul, when among you, accurately and steadfastly taught the word of truth in the presence of those who were then alive. And when absent from you, he wrote you a letter which, if you carefully study, you will find to be the means of building you up in that faith which has been given you." I just like seeing things like these in other texts where the apostles get sort of a little shout out, as I think it just draws home the reality of the New Testament narratives, and that these were real people in real communities who were being impacted by the power of the gospel. There's also some warnings and harsh words against those who teach Docetism, if I'm saying that correctly, which is the false teaching and belief that Jesus' humanity was an illusion, and that he was more like a phantom with the appearance of humanity rather than actual flesh and bone. Polycarp calls those false teachers the firstborn of Satan, quoting 1 John 4, and he also expresses that he is deeply grieved for one of the church leaders whom he knew had fallen into sin, and stresses that the church should avoid similar sin and call him back to repentance in love. In light of this, Polycarp urges the church to remember the teaching they received, which had been handed down to them from the beginning, and return to those principles that they were taught. To quote again from the letter, some of those principles: watching unto prayer, and persevering in fasting, beseeching in our supplications the all-seeing God, not to lead us into temptation, as the Lord had said, the spirit is truly willing, but the flesh is weak. Along with this letter, Polycarp also included all of Ignatius's epistles, which were highly commended to be read and passed on among the churches. And Ignatius is someone we'll get to in the next few days, because he and Polycarp are friends. Overall, this letter feels very familiar and is just as encouraging to the Pauline just as encouraging as the Pauline letters we read in the New Testament, which is unsurprising in some ways, since Polycarp knew and was discipled by the Apostle John and met with many others who had seen and known Jesus, and so possibly picked up on certain teaching and writing styles. Or on the other hand, the style of the letters that Paul wrote was just typical of that day and age for that kind of intent. Either way, it's very familiar. Polycarp is regarded as a link to the apostolic era due to his association with John and others who knew Jesus, with his witness being highly regarded as he could testify to the genuine tradition of apostolic teaching and doctrine against that of heretical teachers who were cropping up. This letter is definitely well worth at least one complete read-through in order to fully appreciate it and see why it was a popular and important epistle which was circulated among the early churches. That's it for that one. Tomorrow we start with our letters of Ignatius to the various churches, which are very exciting. So don't forget to give this a thumbs up and subscribe and share it and all the other social media things people do. Bye.